Hello everyone, my name is Jeff Aliber and I'm Mocana Senior Director of Product Marketing. I want to welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's entitled Understanding IEC 62443 and Other Cybersecurity Standards. Joining me today is Dean Weber, Mocana's Chief Technology Officer. Welcome, Dean.
Welcome.
One piece of housekeeping, at the end of today's session, you'll be able to download both a copy of this presentation and a detailed white paper about ISA 62443. And that will be available at the Attachments and Links tab on the right-hand side of your screen. So with that, today's webinar is the first of three that's focused on cybersecurity standards around the industrial Internet of Things. The focus today is on compliance-based versus risk-based standards, and Dean is going to spend time today talking about what those are and the importance thereof. Part two of the series is going to be focused specifically on understanding ISA 62443 and its importance to IIoT deployments, and then part three will be a deep dive around 62443. If you have any questions that you want to submit, you have the ability to do that on the Feedback from Audience tab, also on the right-hand side of your screen. So as mentioned, today's session is an introduction to compliance and risk-based cybersecurity standards for the industrial Internet of Things. Dean plans to talk about differences in approaches, provide examples, and discuss shortcomings. He's also going to talk about why he believes that adherence to both compliance, or what I'm going to call industry-specific, and risk-based or more cybersecurity-focused standards is important. So without further delay, I'd like to welcome and introduce Dean Weber, Mocana CTO. And Dean, I remember being incredibly impressed when we first spoke regarding your cybersecurity expertise and experience. Can you share with attendees a little bit about your background and some of the relevant experiences that you bring to your role as CTO of Mocana?
Well, you can see from the picture that I'm officially a graybeard, so I've been doing this long enough to have earned all of those gray hairs. Yes, I've been doing this a fairly long time.
I was told you're only 23, but...
Yeah, I'm dyeing my beard white. No, I mean, the short answer is I've been doing this for 1975, so that's, 44 years? Long time. The idea behind migrating from IT security to OT security has always intrigued me. I was involved in some OT security before there was OT, and I was involved in some IT security before there was IT, and over the span of my career I've had an opportunity to work in both. And you know, the current focus needing to be on OT security because it stands to impact our way of life, probably the greatest of any of the risks that I see out there today. I mean, you know, IT risk is about reputation and finance. OT risk can be specifically about loss of life. So we've got a lot of work to do in that space, and that's what we're here talking about today.
Well, I thank you for providing that insight, and I would agree. We're now in a space as someone who's also spent about 20 years mostly on the cybersecurity side for IT. I could not agree more that both there's work to be done, and instead of worrying about data, we are worrying about things like loss of life, environmental disasters, and such. So yes, a very important area. So before we continue on with the presentation, I want to pause briefly, and I'm going to ask our attendees, and right now we're up about 55 so far, which is a great number. What is your interest in learning about compliance standards such as ISA IEC 62443? You're going to have about 50 seconds to vote, and then we'll continue on with the presentation once that's complete. So if everyone could take the time to vote, that'd be great. looks like so far it's a consistent 100% information purposes only, with only 2 votes. So folks, again, if you could take the time to vote, that'd be great.
This really helps us further tune the series as well as future presentations that we make.
So you think if we made this political and we asked them about the elections next year,
we're not going there.
We'd get a bigger turnout here.
I think we'd have a bigger turnout, but we're not going there.
All right. So it looks like just over about 70% of you are looking for information purposes only, and 13% are on the webinar because your enterprise is required to comply with industry-specific cybersecurity standards. So translation, this is highly relevant, which is great. So let's move forward to there. I want to thank everyone for their answers. Before we dive into our discussion regarding compliance, Dean, I'd like to ask about the backstory that's driving this need for IoT and the cybersecurity standards. Certainly, you just spoke a little bit about some of the downside with regard to the world that we're living in and the need to protect. But what about digital transformation? Where is that in all of this?
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it's all about being more effective at our respective jobs and roles, whether that's in the pure industrial space or in the integration space between industrial and network function. The digital transformation is all about taking a lot of the analog functions that we used to provide in the OT environments and turning them into digital functions. Obviously, analog functions tend to be a little less risky in terms of external manipulation of signaling, because we're talking about 24 volts DC, or we're talking about 420 milliamps, or we're talking about, if you go all the way back to like 60 milliamp make break. These are signaling technologies in the analog side that were not easy to intercept and or interrupt. In today's world, with those controls and controllers going digital, the opportunity to impact the data being generated by those devices is much greater. And so the digital transformation itself is a great thing in terms of being able to do our jobs more efficiently. But the downside of that is we have to bring the appropriate levels of security controls to those environments, or we risk really screwing things up, because if that data is manipulated, we're making decisions based on bad data.
Absolutely. And clearly, we can see from this next slide that the growth is exponential.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and again, in the idea here that the IIoT endpoints, and again, we're going to use IoT and IIoT interchangeably. IIoT is the industrial Internet of Things. IoT is the Internet of Things. The reality is that there was a separation of those in IoT being more commercially focused and IIoT being more industrially focused. But I think that people have just misplaced that categorization at this point, and it's all mixed. Whether it's a Fitbit on your wrist or a 5G next generation radio infrastructure, it really doesn't matter at this point. They're both commercial and industrial in all of these aspects. So as the endpoints are growing exponentially, the infrastructure to support them has also got to grow exponentially. So it's a compounding effect. It's not just the number of devices, it's the number of connections points for those devices. Hence the significant interest in things like 5G to get additional bandwidth and signaling capabilities of the networks. And again, that's an evolutionary process where we're going to start with 5G signaling over 4G LTE, and then ultimately move into the new radio infrastructure, which will give us the ability to do, all of the band 14 and above stuff in terms of the broad scale of signaling that are available, that the governments are making available to us for wireless communications.
Got it. And so just as the numbers are growing exponentially with regard to deployment, there's also challenges with regard to all of these devices now being taxed. So how is that happening? What are we seeing from an industry perspective today?
Well, so in the industrial world, safety has been job one, rule one, king for many, many, many years. And in the role of safety, the idea was to bring it to a successful conclusion, or to bring it to a safe condition in the event of a fault state or an error state or a race condition. And these are the things that need to be done in order to safely operate an industrial environment. And that's from the industrial edge all the way back to the ICS SCADA world, and potentially further back into the analytics platforms that are sitting in the business networks. The problem, of course, is that these networks are not well aligned. The industrial networks have traditionally been, again, primarily about safety. Cyber was an afterthought, primarily because safety was viewed as the end-all and be-all to all functions that would misbehave in an industrial environment. What we've seen over time is that now some of the malicious-minded individuals in the publicly connected spaces, or even in the privately connected spaces, are now attacking the safety systems as well as the primary systems. So, number one, we haven't done a very good job of advancing the state of cybersecurity in the industrial environments. Number two, we've broadened the exposure of those environments to more aspect in terms of the attack surface itself. So not only are these devices being attacked by the traditional means of things coming into the network as approved or as semi-approved or even as unapproved, but also the network width and breadth has increased and will continue to increase in things like 5G because of the requirements for bandwidth and the requirements for signaling capabilities. So we're in a position where the funnel's going to get a lot larger, and if we don't start really taking a serious hard look at security, we're going to run into problems.
And in fact, the numbers that I've seen consistently for this year alone, Dean, about 300% increase from 2018, about 105 million attacks on IoT devices just in the first half of this year. A crazy number that I saw reported by F-Secure said that from a traffic perspective, and this is against honeypots, they saw 1.44 billion events in 2018. They've seen close to 3 billion just in the first half of 2019. So very consistent with what you're seeing, that the numbers are just staggering. So not surprisingly, there's a lot of folks looking at this and going, what do we need to do? How do we embrace and manage this environment going forward? Interesting quote from Gartner that its governance ranges, that as IoT usage expands, the governance frameworks are important. And from their perspective, that ranges from simple technical tasks such as device audits and firmware updates to more complex issues such as the control of devices and the usage of the information they generate. Why do you think or believe that governance is required, and how can adherence to cybersecurity standards help?
Well, so there's a cornucopia of reasons that go into making that statement effective, ranging from a dearth of cybersecurity knowledge and expertise in the industrial environments. Again, primarily safety as job one. Most of those people are safety engineers. They are not cybersecurity experts. Two is, this is a board level function. So the boards are concerned about the operations and the relative security and safety of their industrial networks. But doing what is right needs a litmus test of what is right. And without some form of guidance from some external bodies, whether that's risk-based and best practices or whether that's compliance-based, part of what we're talking about here today, I think actually both are required at some level. As we know from our IT brethren, just doing the checklist, just doing the compliance checklist does not necessarily make you that much more secure. There are those that say, it's worked for airplanes, and that's true, but we still have airplane images and functions that go awry, whereas when you're doing best practices, you're actually taking into consideration what the actual outcome, desired outcome, is supposed to look like, not what somebody else thinks it's going to look like. And by combining those two elements, I think that's where we really get to the heart of the matter of it's not just regulatory compliance and it's not just best practices. It's actually got to be both.
Got it. And that certainly makes a lot of sense as folks start looking at not just how do I go about doing this, but what's my justification for doing this. Interestingly, we saw some research out of Bain & Company recently that spoke to the fact that based on their research results, vendors could actually charge more and could present their devices as having more value if security was embedded into them. So not just waiting until you're dealing with the operators on the back end, the owner operators, but actually looking at how do I put security in on the front end is one of the manufacturers. So at this point, I'd like to pause again. We have a second question that we want to pose to the audience. Go back to the list, and this question is, what is the primary focus of your current job? And I think it'll become clear in a second as to why we're asking this question. Again, you've got about 50 seconds to respond, and as Dean mentioned, that will help us not only as we frame the rest of this webinar, but also going forward. So I appreciate your taking the time to do this. And if you have questions, there's also a tab that allows feedback from the audience. Please feel free to submit questions, and Dean and I will make a best effort to address them during the course of this webinar.
And while we're waiting on that, again, just to further flesh out the earlier comments, when we think about OT, one of the issues one of the reasons why safety is such a critical factor is, again, because of that loss of life. The industrial spaces are actually more like defense-related or government-related functions where, in the event of a failure, many of these things can actually drop into a situation where people start dying. And in fact, some of the larger industrials actually include in their risk registers a potential for loss of life. They measure risk based on the number of bodies, which is kind of spooky if you think about it. Obviously our defense apparatus is got to do things about defending against loss of life. But when you think about industrials, you don't necessarily think about it in those terms, and yet that is indeed what happens. If a refinery does not come to a safe condition, it can fault to an unsafe condition, which can cause explosions. And again, one of the reasons why the U.S. Department of Homeland Security has segmented the industries up into the 16 segments that they have is so that we can align better with the risk elements of those individuals, right? So whether it's oil and gas or smart grid or water and sewage or transportation or automotive, I mean, we get into the whole autonomous vehicle thing. All of these are industrial functions that need to be addressed from both a compliance standard as well as from a best practices standard. Back to you, Jeff.
Great, thanks, Dean. So how would you define a compliance-based standard? And what are some examples of compliance-based standards, and how would you describe, I guess, secondarily, shortcomings from a cybersecurity perspective?
Well, so if you look at what organizations like the National Institutes of Science and Technology have done, or Standards and Technology have done, they've presented the basis for regulatory compliance. Probably the largest of which is NIST 853R4 in support of FISMA. FISMA is a U.S. government requirement for all computing systems in the government environs outside of the DoD, and 853R4 are the compliance objectives that fit inside of that, and it's all based on a risk analysis that starts with confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And again, most of these others all come from a similar condition. They may call it a little something different, they may address it a little differently, but at the end of the day, it's all about what am I trying to achieve, and what should I be trying to achieve based on the relative risk of the element. So first doing the risk reporting on the compliance objective side, and then applying the appropriate control mechanisms and demonstrating those control mechanisms, which is the compliance part. On the best practices side of that, the compliance piece just says that that's somebody's idea of what we should be doing, right? So if the risk is high and we want to have access to a high-risk environment from a compliance objective, these are the things that we have to do. That's not necessarily good security. That's somebody's opinion of a broad-based architecture of how to apply a control objective to something that needs to be within compliance, and that's with air quotes around it. On the other side of that is, what do I have to do to actually operate this function securely? And the twains may not meet directly. We may have to create a bridge between those two, and that's really what we're starting to talk about here, is that bridge between compliance objectives and risk-based approaches to best practices. In terms of what are the standards that are out there, again, there's a lot of them that are out there. Again, we're talking about 62443 here today. 62443 is a industry organization that is contributed by many different organizations. Some go as far back as the ANSI baselines of ISA 99, and then further out into the industrial environment, or the international environments of ISO and IEC, where everybody contributes what they think are best practices. We come together as groups, we talk about them, we potentially test them, and then we give a diagram of what we think the 62443 standard objectives should be in terms of a compliance objective. But remember, 62443 today is not a regulatory element, otherwise made as a regulatory element by organizations. It is not something like ISO 27000X, which is required for data center operations. It's going to get there, but it's not there yet today. So again, in a framework of control objectives, 62443 gives you a solid design precept of how do we build secure industrial environments. How do we measure risk? How do we adjudicate risk? How do we determine what level of risk we should be addressing? Right? Is this something that, we're talking about a person with very modest means and a laptop sitting in his grandmother's basement or her basement? Or is this, a near-peer nation state with, full enterprise capacity of the resources of a government, and or the establishment of some form of government assistance in those objectives? So these are all things that have to be brought to bear when you're thinking about how to assess risk, and then once risk is assessed, then determining what risk mitigation technologies can be applied to reduce that risk to an acceptable level.
So would you say that, in general, the compliance-based standards don't go far enough from a cybersecurity standpoint, and that you should always look at balancing them with something like 62443?
I don't know that not going far enough is the right characterization. I would say that there's still, on both sides, there's still enough subjectivity. And again, I'll go back and use FISMA as an example, right? So the whole NIST 853R4 control objective framework is all about very prescriptive elements at multiple levels, right? Low, medium, and high against confidentiality, integrity, or availability. So it's a 3x3 matrix. But at the end of the day, the organization that is applying those control objectives to their environment has basically 4 mechanisms at their disposal. One is they can say, yes, I meet these compliance objectives because I do X, Y, and Z. And that can be viewed by an auditor or reviewed by an internal administrative function to say, yes, I have actually achieved that and it's independently observed. That's what's called a primary control objective. If I can't meet the primary control objective, maybe because of a technical design function, then I might be able to achieve something very similar. But again, this is where we start getting a little more subjective. The similarity, right, which is not the letter of the law of a primary objective, it is a secondary objective typically associated with my best effort, and then being third-party audited as that best effort is actually achieving or not achieving the desired outcome. And then if that doesn't work, then there's a concept of a POAM, right, which is a plan of actions and milestones, where within the United States government you can say, I can't meet the primary objective, I can't meet the compensating control today, but I have a plan that's going to get me there over the next 6 months. And I file that plan with the auditing authority, and the auditing authority then holds me to that plan of actions and milestones at the milestones level, ultimately getting to the control objective, primary or compensating, that we're trying to get to. Now, this is where things get really interesting, because an organization can say, look, I can never meet that control, but I'm willing to accept the risk. Now, by personally accepting the risk, that is a judgment call on an individual's part, on a system security officer or a risk assessment officer, that is saying, look, in my environment, I can't meet that objective, right? There's just no physical possibility for me to do that. I can't design a compensating control. I can't develop a plan to get to a compensating control or primary objective. So I'm going to accept the risk. And if something bad happens, then you're going to come take it out of my hide. But those 4 elements work together to meet a compliance objective that is 853R4 via law, which is FISMA. That's great, except that a lot of that goes on, and bad things happen in those dark spaces between acceptable risk and unacceptable risk as judged by a person's opinion, which is why the other side of that, which is where we get to best practices, we start saying, what is something that I could apply to this? Is there an effective means of alternate controls or a group of alternate controls that I can bring together, or a design precept that I could have applied that would have helped me reduce the risk of not being able to comply with this objective? And that's where the stuff starts really snapping together. That make sense?
That makes great sense. And in fact, I think that's a great segue to the next slide, which is an example. So I know that Mocana recently was doing some work with Mitsubishi and Hitachi, where both compliance-based and risk-based standards came into play. Maybe you can talk through this for the audience.
Sure. In this case, the owner-operator required a 62443 compliance objective available as a function of the purchase of the equipment. So the manufacturer of the equipment is now in a situation where they have to develop the frameworks to provide to their consumers, and this goes back again to, are you selling based on security being a business enabler, or are you selling as security as an afterthought? Because security as an afterthought almost always costs a lot more money and is far less effective than building it in. But from a market perspective, if the consumer is saying, look, I need 62443 compliance, my governance board for my organization, for my public utility, is saying I need to be 62443 compliant. So you, manufacturer, need to provide me evidence and artifacts of 62443 compliance in the products that I purchase from you. And that is indeed what we saw in this particular situation, where in order to get to those compliance objectives, in this case it was NERC-CIP, we had to have the manufacturer include control architectures within their product design and operations guidance that met those requirements as consumed by the owner-operator.
And is this something, this adoption of security at the manufacturer level, something that you're seeing more of, or is it still really in the early stages from your perspective?
Well, because, again, going back to elements of objectives being put out by places like the Department of Homeland Security, where inside the 16 critical industries, there is now guidance that is coming out to say you need to comply with these types of objectives. They're not coming out and saying it's FISMA for commercial. They're saying it's going to get there. So you might as well start thinking about it now. So those organizations, those owner-operators, those manufacturers or downstream manufacturers that are concerned with what the government is going to regulate or what the industry is going to regulate further down the road are already thinking about how they would comply with some of those objectives. So it's not a requirement yet, but it is likely to become a requirement. So the short answer to your question is absolutely, people are looking at control objectives as means to establish compliance with future state regulatory elements.
Which, again, makes complete sense. I know that I was at a conference on medical devices, and there was a senior representative there from the FDA who essentially was looking at being able to put the FDA in a position where they could say to a manufacturer, here are the things you're going to need to do, and if you don't do them, we have the authority to not license your technology. So getting ahead of the curve in terms of adhering to SMART standards certainly makes a whole lot of sense in that regard.
That is another great example of the healthcare world where we talk about the 510, which is the FDA authority to operate when we're talking about patient data or relative patient data. And the FDA in the past has kind of left it up to the medical community via HIPAA and high-tech to try and regulate that data, and has recognized that that's just not getting it done, right? There's no super teeth into HIPAA and high-tech. There is some, and there has been advances in that state, but it's not happening fast enough, and as a result, patients are still being damaged by having their information disclosed. So FDA comes along and says, well, we're going to start back at the equipment manufacturer level because that's what we regulate, and we can't go straight to regulation because that would be unfair to the industry writ large, but we'll start by issuing pre-market guidance. So pre-market guidance is about, here's the things that we're going to be looking at going into the future. We would strongly suggest that you as manufacturers start thinking about how to incorporate these kinds of capabilities into your products so that we can be prepared for regulation in the future. Basically the same concept that we were just talking about with Mitsubishi, where it's not yet a compliance requirement, it's not law, but it is strongly recommended, and those that meet those guidance objectives are going to have a better market opportunity because it is likely that as those regulatory compliance elements come down, that you will then be able to achieve them and not have to change your infrastructure or your operations models.
And as you said earlier, it's a lot less expensive to put security in on the front end rather than having to do it retroactively on the back end. One question from the audience. One question that came in from the audience, Dean, looking for clarification. It says in the current example of utility grid operator, they require 62443 for a solution coming in, but they were under NERC-CIP themselves. So they're looking for clarification.
I think what the question is asking there is that why are we using a 62443 operational model for a NERC-CIP compliance element? And the short answer is because the best example I have of a risk-based best practices is coming out of 62443, where NERC-CIP is a compliance objective that is hard-coded. So when we think about from the manufacturing perspective, right, NERC-CIP is primarily around the operations of the equipment, not the equipment itself. 6443 is about the relative security of the equipment design and deployment, where CIP is the operation of the equipment once it is deployed. And again, this particular manufacturer recognized, working with their customer, that 62443 at the manufacturing level was going to equate to NERC-CIP regulatory compliance down the road when they got to the operational phases of the equipment.
So a perfect example of the synergy of employing both compliance-based and risk-based standards.
That's correct.
Thank you. So I'm going to skip forward to our last polling question, which is, does cybersecurity for IoT or Industrial Internet of Things endpoints need to address concerns about GDPR violations? And let me pull that up to start voting, and that's going to be the next part of our discussion with regard to the webinar.
And,
so
again, that's
to complete that.
That's a great similarity to the clarification question, right? What does GDPR have to do with cybersecurity for IoT endpoints? And the concerns are the industrial environment as entry point or potentially as exit point, depending on your point of view, of the risk into GDPR privacy invasions and release of information. So when we think about GDPR, we think about it in the broad aspect of personally identifiable information. That's the primary risk factor associated with GDPR, and the data associated with that PII. So if the data in an industrial environment that had PII in it was released as a function of a weakness in an industrial component, the GDPR violation would be against the owner-operator. The actual weakness would be against the developer or deployer of the equipment in an insecure fashion. And so what we're seeing is that as organizations start to become concerned with the downstream risk of GDPR compliance, I use as the example that if we had a customer that was an owner-operator that had a loss of information as a result of an inappropriate deployment of OpenSSL with known vulnerabilities published at the point of deployment, and if that was to occur and could be proven that it was the OpenSSL deployment of the equipment manufacturer in a inherently insecure state that caused the GDPR violation, the owner-operator is going to turn around and sue the pants off of the equipment manufacturer to say, you caused me to have a GDPR violation. And we're starting to see more and more of that concern between the owner-operator communities and the equipment manufacturing communities, who by themselves are not necessarily eligible for GDPR fines other than it relates to their own operations.
So is this a hypothetical scenario, or has this happened in real life?
I can neither confirm nor deny the answer to that question. I can tell you that I have been asked by several international large organizations about dealing with some of those downstream risk issues and how we might be able to help them address some of those risks.
And in fact, we are aware that there's at least one known exploit, if you will, that has resulted in a massive lawsuit, hundreds of millions of dollars, towards a manufacturer based on this very scenario.
That is correct.
All right. So I guess my last question with regard to this topic, Dean, is my understanding is you came out of semi-retirement to be CTO of Mocana. What was it about the company and what it's doing that got you excited?
So when I was a CTO for Global Cybersecurity at Computer Sciences Corporation prior to its merge/integration with HPE to form DXC Technologies. And, I'm of an age where that was starting to look like, I'm thinking about slowing down. I hung my consulting shingle out, and I was starting to take on some consulting business. I'd actually had some business integration efforts with Mocana back in the 2012 range, where I wanted to acquire them as part of CSC Cybersecurity for specifically some uses of their cryptographic functions. And we couldn't agree on a price. So I knew a lot about Mocana. An opportunity came forward in 2016 after I'd left CSC, and I was in a position where either I was going to continue to take on more and more work and have to fire up a new business around the consulting opportunities, or I was going to have to close down the consulting and do something else, either fully retire, which I don't think I was ready for yet, or to actually get involved with another technology. And when Mocana popped up on the radar screen, this was a technology that I was heavily interested and invested in. I think it stands to make a considerable contribution to the overall security of the industrial environments that it participates in. I think that it has the opportunity to change the game in terms of how cybersecurity is implemented and viewed in the industrial spaces, and ultimately it leaves the world a safer place than when we started. So that's my my story, and I'm sticking to it.
It's a great story. I think there are more than a few of us that signed up based on similar views. So I want to thank everybody at this point for attending today's webinar. We are a couple minutes before time running out, and I want to thank Dean especially for sharing his valuable insights and expertise with us. I also want to invite everybody to join us on January 15th for the second webinar in this series, which is going to focus specifically on 62443, much more of a deep dive around this risk-based standard and how it is applied specifically to industrial, access control systems, the devices, as opposed to the environment. So with that, again, we're going to sign off. We've got over 90 people from around the world that have been listening in today. And again, I want to thank everyone for taking the time out of their day to participate. And again, Dean, wonderful information. Thank you for sharing, and look forward to doing this again in January.
Thank you, and thank you for all participating.
All right, and again, I want to remind everybody that there are downloads available on the Attachments and Links tab, where right now you can get a copy of a detailed white paper around 62443, and we will also be making available a copy of this presentation. So with that, again, I want to thank everybody for participating, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Take care, everybody.